If I told you, I would have to kiss you. A novel by May Marvel. Chapter 1. The Ritz-Carlton, Toronto. Yardley Whitmer held her champagne flute aloft, wondering if her smile looked natural or like the grimace on a French revolutionary's death mask. It felt like the latter. But in the end, my darling Tommy, the number of guests, the number of flower arrangements, even the number of bridesmaids doesn't matter. The only number that matters to me is 3,572. The bride reached up to press a finger to the corner of her eye and give the groom a convincing, non-grimacing smile. That's 9 years, 9 months, and 17 days, she said. How long I've had with you so far. And now, my love, the only number that matters is how many thousands of days we'll have together next. Tommy leaned over and kissed his beloved, then pulled off a very tasteful clink of his crystal lowball glass against her champagne flute while the crowd of rich white Canadian guests went wild. Yardley took a sip to rinse away the involuntary burn of tears in the back of her throat. She was the worst kind of sucker for romantic declarations. Childhood fantasies of crystal and taffeta weddings had trailed into her adulthood like a heartbroken ghost. Never mind that she was a lesbian, an orientation that had barred her from the ostentatious nuptials of her dreams until the Supreme Court finally came to its senses in her early 20s. By then, it didn't matter, because Yardley was well on her way to achieving another childhood dream by becoming a case officer for the Directorate of Operations at the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. In other words, a spy. The life of a spy was incompatible with long-term romantic commitments. Yardley had known this from the outset, but with Casey, she'd made the mistake of letting herself get sentimental. She'd started to believe she could have a home and a woman all her own to come home to. She'd helplessly surrendered to her childhood dream by falling for a pint-sized, red-headed computer nerd. And what did she have to show for it? 6 weeks of rolling over on the stiff guest bed mattress to find the sheets cold and no Casey whispering a little something in her ear. That was what. Security has moved off the east stairwell. Atlas, her handler, interrupted her reverie. Got it, she murmured into her champagne flute. Sliding the long blonde waves of her wig off her shoulders, Yardley subtly surveyed the ballroom. You have entry into the suite for me? She flicked her gaze away from an immaculately groomed man in a tuxedo, whom she'd accidentally made brief eye contact with. Negative, Atlas answered. You'll have to get in the old-fashioned way. The man was now strolling in her direction, smoothing both hands over his dark hair, seemingly certain of sexual conquest. She could work with that. Hello there. He took a flute off a passing tray and tipped it in Yardley's direction. You must have been sitting in the back during the ceremony. I hadn't noticed you until now. There was the tiniest smear of brow gel above one of his eyebrows. I snuck in late. She gave him an adorable nose wrinkle and a hint of dimple, wanting him to see her as just another moneyed, winsome blonde. I've actually been dying to pop up to my room for 10 minutes to freshen up before the dancing starts. But silly me, I lost my key card. She touched her earring to tip her camera toward the man so Atlas could get a picture. The eyebrows drew together in a deep furrow. Didn't they send you the app download? Shoot. Copy that, the voice in Yardley's ear said. She fumbled with the clutch for her phone, buying herself a moment to listen while she tamped down a blaze of anger. The fact that this hotel's rooms were keyed with an app ought to have been part of her briefing, but to call the preparation for this short-notice operation scant would be generous. Yardley wasn't feeling generous. Atlas's voice returned with a crackle of static. Get us a device loaded with a key to any room, and Tech can do the rest. There it is! Yardley sounded awestruck as she pulled out her bejeweled phone. Oh my gosh, I've been traveling so much lately. I completely forgot they do the app thing for room keys here. No wonder I couldn't find it. She winked at the man. I could follow you up and show you how it works. He knocked back the rest of his champagne, and, like an unearned promotion, another tray passed by to receive his empty just in time. Why don't you just save me a dance? Yardley stepped forward and touched his lapel. I really do need to freshen up. His expression went through a series of independent verifications of the likelihood her request was genuine before it smoothed out with a bland smile. Of course. Atlas spoke again. The target's in line at the bodega, but it's only a 5-minute walk. You've got 10 to get the job done. 15 tops. I'll be back in a jiff. She smiled, brushed against the man's jacket as she distracted him with a quick arm squeeze, and sighted a path to the east stairwell as she slipped the phone she'd just stolen from her would-be lover into her clutch. Can you break the suite's lock with the prize I got you? She asked, safely out of earshot. Affirmative. The faintest hint of feedback accompanied Atlas's reply. These earpieces liked to kick up a fuss about being underground or deep in the interior of a vast building like the Ritz-Carlton, presumably because the agency knew there was nothing that provided quite the same rush as the mortal fear of running a black bag operation on skimpy intelligence with no link to the outside world. Or it could be... Yardley was getting cynical. Project Maple Leaf had her overexposed. 10 weeks ago, just as the leaves were turning red on the oak tree outside of the window of the bedroom Yardley used to share with KC, and there had still been a chance, however faint, of salvaging their 3-year relationship, Toronto became the testing ground for a completely new kind of digital weapon. When deployed, it killed every cell tower, internet signal, and communication line in a 30-mile radius around the city. For 47 minutes, the device grounded planes, imperiled hospital patients, and shut down electronic systems of every imaginable type and function, causing not a little panic. No one took credit for the stunt, but the word on the street was that the weapon hadn't worked as advertised. Something technical had gone wrong. Still, the promise of a digital device capable of delivering mass chaos came through loud and clear, and the agency was desperate to lock it down before it could be perfected and sold. Yardley had spent 2 months chasing leads around the globe, with ever-diminishing returns. Today, her mission was to break into the suite of a woman whose web activity suggested to the agency's analysts that she might be involved in the weapon's development. Status update on the door. Yardley leaned down to ease off her heels so she could take the stairs more quickly. The target suite was 20 flights up. Tabasco's working on it. Dang it. If Tabasco was handling the tag, that suite's lock would be hacked in no time. Less than no time. Tabasco was a technical agent, one of dozens who worked in the bowels of the headquarters building. To a field agent like Yardley, the techs were largely interchangeable, known to her only by their code names. But Tabasco was the exception. According to the rumor mill, Tabasco was a child genius who'd hacked the red phone on the president's desk. The director was said to ask for their reports personally, eschewing all other technicians. Yardley started to run. Growing up, She'd loved nothing more than to drive around the Piedmont with her granddaddy, listening to his stories about the years he'd spent spying on the Russians. No question, those stories hooked her but good, and they were absolutely the reason she was currently barefoot, quads burning, trying not to pant as she flung her body up flight after flight. Unfortunately, not once in all those stories he'd told her over all the years she'd made him tell them, had Yardley Whitmer, Sr. of Cary, North Carolina, bothered to mention how much time spies spent running. Yardley never remembered this when she let herself sleep late instead of going for a run. She stopped on the 10th floor landing, chest heaving, and gave herself over to self-censure. Casey never skipped a run, and she wasn't even a spy. She was a web marketing freelancer for companies that sold things like health supplements and sustainable t-shirts. In fact, Casey had been running a lot in the 6 weeks since they broke up. Not that Yardley could blame her. Miles running the Glade Stream Valley in Reston, Virginia, was 1,000 times better than the miles of awkward silence between them as they lurched side by side through the death of their relationship. She made herself start climbing again, ignoring the burn in her throat, the same burn that returned whenever she thought about weddings and empty, cold sheets, and what Casey used to do and didn't anymore. Or how fast she'd fallen for her at that backyard picnic where they first met. How much they'd laughed, especially the first year, when Yardley's life was a whirlwind of missions and covert ops and briefings in between, trying out food trucks with Casey, exploring the city, walking in the summer heat, and kissing like it was the only reason to keep breathing. Not now, Whitmer. She rounded the final landing. "Second suite past the fire door," Atlas said. "We've almost got the code. Tabasco's impressed. It seems either the target or someone working with them reprogrammed the lock with their own layer of security." "That's fantastic," she panted. She stopped in front of the suite, keeping her head down and away from the hallway camera. "Not easy to impress Tabasco. So glad to know there's a new and exciting barrier to the successful completion of this op." "Hold on," Atlas said, chuckling. "Almost there." Yardley retrieved her phone from her clutch and leaned against the wall, gazing and poking at the screen to give the impression of mindlessly scrolling as she waited. Her own phone was back in Virginia, but Yardley's texts and voicemails forwarded to her field phone when she was on assignment. If she were captured, everything would be wiped remotely to prevent the sensitive details of her personal life from falling into the hands of the enemy. But there was nothing compromising on the screen cradled in Yardley's palm. The only human communication she'd received all day was a single text from KC. "Guy in a big truck came by to pick up your moving pod. Gave me attitude because I told him it's not ready and you're not here. Maybe deal with that." Casey worked from home. She didn't like being interrupted. She'd barely looked up from her computer when Yardley lied and said she had to take a last-minute trip to New York for work. It used to be that when she was in the field, Yardley's phone would fill up with messages from her girlfriend. Memes Casey thought were funny, videos of baby pigs, Yardley's favorite kind of animal videos. "I love yous. I miss yous." She sighed. She'd forgotten to change the pickup date on the pod. Most of her things were boxed up and loaded into it, but the apartment she'd leased wouldn't be ready to move into for another 2 weeks, and both her presence in Casey's house and her absence from it seemed to irritate Casey equally. She never smiled anymore. When they first met, Casey's elfin smile was the first thing Yardley had noticed about her. It was a tricky one, curled up at the edges, and it came with freckles and short strawberry hair that had made Yardley feel like she'd been handed a bouquet of fancy spring flowers. Anything? She asked Atlas in a low voice. Obsessive spycraft provided an excellent distraction from the quivering pulp left of her heart. 30 seconds. She blew out a slow breath. That should be it, Atlas said, just as Yardley heard the soft whir of a tumbler. The lock plate lit up a green LED. Tabasco had done it again. She turned to the brass handle. I'm in. What do the sisters have to report about our target? Canadian Intelligence, CSIS, known in the trade as the Sisters, was handling surveillance. She left the bodega, but it looks like she's going to take a break in the park to feed the ducks. Yeah, she's settling in with, yep, that's a sleeve of crackers. Non-standard choice of recreation, but it helps us out. Good. Yardley scanned the enormous luxury suite and whistled. Double dang. She walked over the marble floors toward the windows that looked out over the CN Tower in Lake Ontario. There was a 5-seat banquette table with glove leather soft chairs, a lot of muted, expensive drapery, and the remains of what appeared to be a multi-course seafood lunch on a side table. You guys ever think we're working for the wrong side? You'd couch surf and eat nothing but beanie weenies if it meant you could be a patriot for the agency, Atlas said. No one's ever going to turn the unicorn with fancy penthouse suites. If someone did, I'd know it was time to defect. Yardley rolled her eyes while she used an electronics meter to scan as many square inches as she could in the vast suite. They'd started calling her the Unicorn on her first mission, when it became clear how her background as a Southern debutante and sorority princess enhanced her capabilities as a CIA officer. It was a combination hard to find among the usual recruits. Yardley was glad her queer friends only knew her too boring to ask about civilian cover as a Securities and Exchange Commission compliance consultant. They'd have a field day if they ever found out she was actually an infamous international lesbian spy known as the Unicorn. Her meter flashed. The safe, she said. That's disappointing. So obvious. Yardley leaned closer to the hotel safe, discreetly tucked behind the door of a tiger maple credenza. Boring one, too. Biometric lock. No fun to crack. She paused, looking closer. But maybe she does have a few tricks up her sleeve. We have an Elizabeth Bentley fan on our hands. A what? Atlas's voice was a little faint. We've almost got a profile you can use to open it. Stand by. She crouched to the side of the safe, where the light just caught the thin black thread stretching across the fingerprint screen. No one knows their spy history. Elizabeth Bentley, Soviet spy who defected to the FBI after the Second World War. Our guys were constantly tossing her place in Brooklyn to make sure they weren't being double-crossed, so she protected her secrets by placing black threads over the openings of trunks and boxes to tell her if they'd been disturbed. You obviously paid a lot more attention to your history coursework during training than I did. I read history as a hobby. Yardley kept her voice low and her senses alert as she spoke. Military, spy stuff, a bit of dabbling in archaeology. Did you know it was women who identified Roman artifacts that had been misidentified for decades? It had never occurred to men that the ancient toys they were digging up might perhaps be miniature versions of ordinary household items. We found a lot more brooms and saucepans than cool weapons, it turns out. That story is what inspired me to build that 1/12 scale model of a Roman domus I told you about. I have an order of scale cornerstone coming from the UK. You're a strange ranger, Unicorn, Atlas said with a smile in their voice. Yardley Whitmer. I love you, but you are a lot. That was how her mama always put it. You should have met me as a kid. I spent half my time shooting and fishing with my granddaddy and the other half pretending to be one of the founding fathers. I used to write letters to General Washington in code, just in case the British intercepted them. My parents despaired. You're exaggerating. I most certainly am not. She finished photo documenting the room and the safe, then got to work easing the black thread away from the fingerprint screen. Everything coming through okay? Yeah, we put your fingerprint profile into the hotel system. Go ahead. Yardley pressed her finger against the screen, and the safe door's lock chunked, allowing the door to open a quarter of an inch. Move your hair back so I can get a better picture. Yardley brushed aside her wig hair and surveyed the contents of the safe. There was an EU passport, a thumb drive, and a greeting card envelope, its corners furred and soft. She slid the thumb drive into one of the input slots on her agency phone so her team could pull the data. Then she opened the envelope. Wow, that's interesting. Yardley held the black and white ultrasound photo up so the camera could see it. The date on the photo put the person at least 6 months into pregnancy. Huh. All right. We got the drive. You can disengage it. Yardley slid the device out of her phone and set it back in the safe. She flipped the cover on the passport and began photographing the pages. Parent-to-be is Chris Flynn, she said. Female, Irish citizen, 32 years old. Target's on the move, Atlas said. ETA, under 3 minutes. Yardley closed the safe, did her best to replace the thread, and started toward the suite's entrance. Then she stopped. The side table with the seafood lunch caught her attention. Something about the way the discarded dishes were shoved aside to make an open space. She crossed the room for a better look. The corner of the table closest to a comfortable chair was clear, with 2 empty plastic bottles of herbal iced tea nearby. On the wall, she noted a 4-outlet plug. 2 cords lay abandoned on the ground, one for a laptop, the other a phone. The woman, Chris Flynn, must have taken the tech with her to the bodega. The 3rd plug charged a battery backup brick. The last one held a charger cord that snaked behind the buffet with the minibar. Yardley extended her electronics scanner along the path of the cord, watching the meter carefully for a reading. Nothing. She got down on her hands and knees and followed the cord. Crackling static told her that Atlas was trying to speak, and probably telling her again to get the hell out. But Yardley's stomach had swooped with déjà vu. The adapter on the 4th charging cord looked eerily familiar. She reached behind the buffet, following the cord, and then felt what she'd been hoping for. A 2nd laptop. Hurry, Atlas said. Yardley thought of KC. That was what the state of the tabletop and the mess of cords had reminded her of, when KC was up to her neck in freelance work and set up a command station in the living room. Food shoved out of the way, laptop balanced on the edge of the remaining surface, empty drink bottles everywhere. The size and weight of the boxy black laptop pinged a similar memory. She opened the lid, already half certain what she'd see. The screen lit up with the icon of a dragon eating its tail. Bingo. Yardley clicked the computer shut. I don't think Chris Flynn's a wild goose chase, everyone. I don't think she's an intermediary. I think she's the person we've been looking for. Once, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, when Yardley and Casey were still on naked Sunday morning terms, Casey was working on a big project for a blue chip brand. Their app had been hacked, and their engineer fixed it, but they'd wanted Casey to check their security. Yardley vaguely knew Casey sometimes dabbled in internet security, but when she'd dragged a couple of laptops into bed, Yardley started asking questions. She liked to keep up on her tech. It came in handy. Casey had explained the basics, mainly that she kept a special computer for jobs like this. The heavy, boxy laptop had enough capacity to allow Casey to remotely load the contents of a server over a private network she set up. Yardley had lazily watched her connect the client's servers one by one to run the laptop's program, searching for holes in the server's security. Flynn's either a network security specialist with the Irish equivalent of 2 weeks vacation and a 401k, or else she's a hacker, Yardley said. Like a hacker's hacker. And this laptop was cloaked against scanning, so she doesn't want anyone to know. Something's wrong. Atlas's tone was suddenly urgent. The sisters are scrambling. Get out of there. Yardley shoved the laptop back behind the buffet. She knew from Casey's lesson that there wouldn't be anything on it but the program, and a lot of drive space and memory to run it. Going. Use the elevator, drop your cover before you hit the lobby, and wait for my okay to leave the building. Copy that. Yardley slipped on her shoes, and then she was out the door, making sure to show the camera her waist-length beachy waves, a practiced walk in heels and nothing else. The elevator doors shushed closed as soon as she stepped inside. Status? The target's gone. Yardley's scalp prickled. Meanin' what exactly? Meaning disappeared. She turned a corner, and the sisters didn't pick her up on the other side. They're checking their cameras, but likely she caught on that we had eyes on her and took evasive maneuvers. Or someone picked her up off the street, Yardley said. Could be a hit. Anyone on their way up. So far, you're clear. We have multiple angles on the lobby. Yardley ran a fingernail under the lace front of her wig, where it was adhered with hairspray. It was the work of a moment to twist the wig into her clutch, loosen her own dark layers from the braids she'd pinned them up in, swipe on a deep red lip, put on Ray-Bans, and drape her shoulders in a dark brown silk scarf that covered her black mini dress enough to render it unremarkable. Car's waiting, Atlas said. Lobby's clear. She breezed out the front doors into a cool, early November afternoon and slid into a black sedan parked near the alley. Hi there, Joe. She unzipped the bag on the seat next to her to retrieve a pair of soft joggers, a t-shirt, a cardigan, and bliss, socks and tennis shoes. When she'd finished changing, she rested her head against the back of the seat and watched urban Toronto roll past the window, briefly wondering if Chris Flynn really was the person who'd made that terrible device. Where had she gone? Had she run or been captured? It was a setback. The agency needed, desperately, to know what Chris Flynn knew. But then, drawing on the hard-won wisdom of 100+ field missions, Yardley made herself stop. Her work was done. She'd made it out in one piece. The rest of that mess was for the analysts to figure out. What's next, Joe? She asked. Your plane's ready at CFB Trenton. It'll land at Dulles en route to taking some Mounties to Vancouver. Tell me it's not a sky van, though. I could. He expertly wove through traffic, but that wouldn't mean it's not a sky van. He laughed at his joke. A small military passenger plane, the sky van was the equivalent of riding in an airport parking lot shuttle, except 30,000 feet in the air. Not exactly comfortable. But it wasn't comfort, really, that got Yardley out of bed in the morning, or put her on planes, trains, and buses and sent her all over the world, risking her blessed hide for information. It was faith that she'd been born with a particular combination of talents and grit, and she had an obligation to use them to make the world better. Working for the agency was how she transformed her purpose into action. Also, call her old-fashioned, But she truly did believe that putting her own self in peril kept other folks, civilians, good people, safe. People who were loved. People who loved others. People like Casey. That was what Yardley thought about on the Sky van between dozing on and off, wiped out from what had been a 36-hour sprint. Casey. How every single time Casey Nolan had smiled in the 1197 days since they met, Yardley felt the same way she did the first time. Like she was coming home.